it raises interesting questions because I don't know who it was, Peter, who came to the rescue of Mario Draghi, but I've actually never really thought about it very closely, but I imagine security is a very big issue, right, at these events, Peter?
Well, it's a reminder why people like Mario Draghi, economic policymakers, not only in Europe but around the world, need to have security. And Janet Yellen has a robust security detail here in Washington. And at her press conferences, you can be sure that there is a healthy dose of security. And the Fed is a very difficult building to access for anyone, including the press, at any time of day. But during these news conferences, there are very strict rules. I'm not going to walk through everything they go through before you're allowed to enter this press conference. But in my experience, this would have been very difficult for someone who was not a working member of the press, credentialed and authorized by a news organization, to be able to participate in a press conference like this, and certainly to be able to approach Mario Draghi in this way. So this is something went wrong with their security protocol here, and my guess is they're going to make some changes. But it's a reminder, these people, their jobs are hard enough, much less to worry about their physical safety. And Betty, you just got to remember what happened to the U.S. ambassador to South Korea just a few weeks ago. That's fresh in the minds of a lot of public officials these days.
And so when Fed officials went, okay, so two questions here, Peter. So have you seen protests before Fed meetings around the building? Or, I mean, do you see stuff like that happening? And is that happening more?
Yes, there have been protests outside of the Fed. Well, what's much more likely to happen here in Washington, and I've seen it happen with Fed officials and certainly with a whole host of people testifying, Henry Kissinger the other day up on Capitol Hill. When you have a public hearing, a congressional hearing, members of the public are allowed in after they go through screening. Anyone from the public can wait in line and get access to a congressional hearing. And we see these kinds of protests all the time there. They're a fairly regular occurrence. This kind of press conference closed setting is different. And I think that's the distinction here. But we do see this all the time. For Fed officials at congressional hearings, this would be an aberration if it were to happen at a Yellen news conference. And
how much I mean, when Yellen travels, give me a sense of her security detail. Does she have a lot?
I don't want to explain everything about the layers of security she has, but anyone who's seen her in a public setting can tell that there are certain people who are with her who are not Fed economists or not Fed staffers. They are security folks who have their responsibility is to be with her basically 24/7 to ensure her safety. I used to see Ben Bernanke at Washington National games all the time as a Fed chairman. Most people didn't recognize him. They might have been looking out for the two people with him at most of the time, maybe even more than that. So they do have a physical presence. And the reality is, Betty, these are controversial people making controversial decisions. And it's not a huge surprise that they get protested. What may be a bigger surprise is that someone could get this close to Mario Draghi. It's got to be unsettling for him, given the job he's in.
It's got to be very unsettling. And, do you expect that even within the Fed now, that the next time they hold a news conference, they might change some protocols at all, given what we've just seen with what happened with Mario Draghi?
Well, even before the Fed, you got to remember what's happening in Washington right now over the next couple of days. The IMF World Bank meetings, which have been the scene of many protests in the past. There's tight security for all these events, but you've got international economic policymakers coming to Washington to talk about some of the very issues Mario Draghi's talking about. And you can be sure that they are now reassessing their own security for the events that are going to play out here through this weekend in Washington. Always tight security for it. There's extra Washington police on duty, overtime duty through the course of these talks, and my guess is they're going to reassess that, and the Fed and everyone else will reassess as well in light of what's happened here. But my guess is the ECB is going to have a real reassessment of its own.
Yes, you can imagine so. All right, Peter, thank you so much. Peter Cook, our chief Washington correspondent.